Hi, this is Bob from Hobby Concepts, and today I'm going to build an Aeromax. Now, I've been wanting to do this truck for a long time, but Tamiya has had real problems getting these things in stock for the last couple years. They finally have got them in good numbers, so I've got them in stock. I was able to grab one. Here it is so far. In this part, we're going to build the chassis up to the point where it runs, and in part two, we'll paint it and detail it. So it's a great looking truck. It's been on my bucket list. Easy to build, looks terrific. Let's get started. So here's the Aeromax kit. Again, it's not a new kit. It's been around for a long time. Tamiya's just been really out of it for the last couple years, but they finally got them back in stock. So it's time for me to build one. You can see it's the normal Tamiya kind of packing. I'll unbox it and we'll kind of go through a few of the parts and then we'll start building it. Okay, so we'll get started on this Aeromax. It's a little bit different than a king hauler or grand hauler in that it uses a battery tray underneath the frame, similar to the night hauler. The instructions are typical Tamiya. Beautiful instructions, full-size drawings of each part, so if you have a question about a screw or something, you can just lay it right on the drawing to see the size of it. They go in stages, so like A stage uses the A bag, and B stage uses the B bag, C stage, and so on and so forth. Now, what I have done is I have done this so far the way I normally do trucks. And that is, I put together the servos, and those are all put together and ready to go. I put together the transmission, and that's all ready to go. And you can see I used a 55 turn motor in here, which is what I usually use when I build trucks. And I put together the rear ends. So, kind of out of order, and I'm not showing the assembly of these because I have a separate video on how to build the transmission. I have a separate video on how to set up the servos, and a separate video on how to build the rear ends. So if you go down to the description of the video and click on more, you'll see links, and I'll put links to these three videos on how to build these three items. When I build trucks, you know, for sale or for customers, whatever, I always just put these three things together first, the way I want. Mainly because it gets rid of a lot of parts off of my finish. Okay, so now let's talk about the Aeromax. I use muffin tins to put my parts in, and you can see I've got bag A and bag C and bag E. I've already opened a couple because, again, building the rear ends and stuff. And then I use a little bread pan to hold the other parts. Keeps my bench clean, and the dollar store provides those quite well. So let's take a look at the frame. The frame says Aeromax. It's stamped in there, which is the only frame I've ever seen from them that actually has the truck name stamped in it. And it's covered with this blue protective film, which we want to make sure we get off before we assemble it. And it's marked L here for left, and then of course the other side is R for right, so we can peel those off and get them ready to go. Now there's a few parts that we need, and I'll peel that off in a minute. A few parts that we need to get the frame put together. So the first one, get this bag open here, we need these cross members. We need 3 of them. They give you 4. I use a pair of side cutter nippers to remove the parts from the tree. So we're going to need those 3. And then in a separate bag they give you this rear cross brace and the front and rear bumper mounts. So those are the parts we need, and the servos, those are the parts we need to get the frame assembled. Now, I also will trim off, you can see there's a little bit of a nib here where I cut the part off. I love to clean these off, just make everything nice and smooth. It only takes a second to do really professional work, and when the truck's done, it's worth it. So you want to just be careful to do things like that, to clean up your parts. I've already done these. So let me get organized, and I'll come back and we'll put this frame together. Alright, so I'm going to put this together, and I start, the way I do it, I start with the left-hand frame. And you got to be a little bit careful, because when you take a look here, there's actually two different lengths of screws, and they're very close together. So when you're sorting out your screws, pay particular attention in this frame assembly step. This cross brace, and most of the screws are these shorter 3x8mm screws. I use a Tamiya screwdriver to put things together. Good quality screwdriver makes all the difference in the world. And I don't use an electric screwdriver. It's way too easy to strip out screws. So this cross brace has 4 screws that hold it together. And this cross brace is the same used in every Tamiya truck. Most of the parts, the frame spacers, all that are the same. So this cross brace has 3 screws back here, and it just lines up with those 3 screws. There's a stamped aluminum part, and if you feel it, one edge is sharp and one edge is kind of rounded from the stamping process. So I always put the rounded part out. And this is where you use that little bit longer screw to assemble it, because of course it's going through an extra piece. So I'm showing a little bit more of the assembly in this truck than I normally do. If you're a beginner, and then we use a short screw here. And the instructions show this really well. So there's our first piece assembled. And then our cross braces mount, and there's a rib here, you can see on the top, not on the bottom, and the rib goes up. So we'll put this one here and put 1 screw in it. Okay, I'll be back in a minute. There's our cross members mounted, and you can see there's 2 screws in each. So we're starting to zip in on one side here. So now we've got our front bumper mount, and right now you only use 1 screw to hold that on, and that's because later our front suspension mounts will mount down here. So now we have our front bumper mount, our cross members. Now the servos mount, and the servos mount, the servo mounts with this ball towards the left. So this assembly just sits in here like this, and a single screw mounts in the back. Again, it's the short screw. And then a single screw mounts in the front. Now this has a slot, because depending on your servos they could move a little bit. So whenever there's a slot, the instructions don't show this, at least on this kit. I always use a washer. Again, just a good practice to have a washer wherever there's a slot. Okay, so that completes our first half. Now, the only thing to do is to put the other side on. And you'll notice that I build one side and then lay the rail on it. Some people will put pieces in and put both sides together and slide pieces in. I used to do it that way, but I found sometimes I'd forget like one piece, put the frame together, and then you can't do it without taking things apart. So I build one side completely and then put the second side on. We'll put one screw in that here. So there's our basic frame assembly. Now I'm going to obviously put the rest of the screws in and put this other piece on, and then we'll move on to the next step. The next step is to put these tanks together. They just go together with a screw in the bottom, but one thing you don't want to forget on this kit is it has a capture nut dropped into this position here on both sides. And that will be very important later because it holds the side panels on. And that's an easy thing to miss, and if you do, you will regret it. And then the screws hold this together. So important to get those capture nuts in. You'll notice that I'm not painting these fuel tanks. Now you could paint them if you want, and I'm all about making my trucks look really nice and painting things, but in this particular truck, later on, when the tanks are in here, they're covered by this huge floor plate, and then they're covered by gigantic side plates, so you can't actually see the tank worth a darn when it's down inside the truck. So I'm not going to bother to paint them. So I'll get the other tank put together. The assembled tanks just slide over the frame and mount. Now, here's an area where you want to use Loctite because you've got metal to metal. You'll notice that up till now, I really haven't used any Loctite because we're driving screws into plastic, and you don't use it there. You only use it where you've got a screw going into metal. So 4 screws hold this on. Gives us our tanks. Now, it's important to note, flip this over here, it's important to note that the recess part goes towards the rear here. And that'll become obvious later when we put in our battery box. There we go. All right, a few more frame pieces to do here. So here's this this front spring bracket and this upright. We'll mount those. This one just mounts with a couple of short little screws. Again, they're going into metal. So very straightforward to mount these. The frames are threaded. One thing I really like about Tamiya kits, boy, everything fits perfect. If you're building a kit like this and something doesn't fit, you're doing something wrong. Just double check. Now the spring hanger, long screw goes through, and then there's a backing plate that has a dimple on it. I always put the dimple away from the spring, and then there's a spacer that you do not want to forget, and they're screwed into plastic, so no Loctite. And this is always a little bit of a trick to get the 3 plates lined up. Especially when I'm trying to do it on camera. Yeah. There we go. So there's our front end with the spring hangers ready to go. Our chassis is looking pretty good. The reason I showed that dimple is on these rear spring hangers, same thing, they're dimpled. So I face the dimple away from the spring whenever I install parts like that. Next step are some more sub-assemblies. These rods, we've got a steering rod. The ends just screw on and you just line it up with the drawing. And then the shift rod. Now this one's just a little tricky because there's 2 different length rods in the kit. One of them is for the coupler and one of them is for the shift rod. And the ends just screw on. And you just twist them down until you get to the length on the paper. You can do the final adjustments later. And my video on setting up the servos shows how to adjust the steering and the shift rods correctly. So you might want to find the link in my description and do that. Then the next thing are the shocks, which look like that. And they simply have a shock shaft, plastic washer. It dropped into the shock body. And then I use a screwdriver to hold the bottom end. And they just go together simply like that. You just turn this in until you feel the tension at the bottom. And drop the screw in, or the spring in it. And the cap just threads on, but it needs Loctite. And I have had cases where I did not Loctite these and they came apart later. So one little drop of Loctite works really good in there. And that gets our other sub-assemblies, the steering rods and the shocks put together. Now the shocks just mount, there's a spacer here that drops into the shock. And it just mounts with a bolt and nut up here on the top. So I'll go ahead and get that mounted. And then these rear spring holders mount with a long bolt. And there's spacers here. Go ahead and cut them off. There's a long spacer and a short spacer. So we drop the bolt through the metal bracket, again, bump out, spacer, bump away from the shock, spacer, and then the frame is threaded. and this just threads into place like that. And if you do it right, these still are movable. There's one thing to note is that there are two different lengths of shoulder bolts. So this is the longer length here. So I'll finish putting the rest of this together. So the front axle assembly is pretty straightforward. Spring mounts here. There's a divot here that the spring sits in. And then you use these U-shackle brackets and an aluminum top part here. Put a tiny bit of Loctite on it. And a couple of nuts. Now, a couple things that are important about this. You can see I've got one side put together already. Those aren't tight, they're just kind of sitting there. Still not tight. I have found that I just barely snugged them up. There's a spring hanger bracket that mounts right here. Put a little bit of Loctite on that. And I don't like to tighten these until after I get this spring hanger bracket on, because it's kind of a tight fit underneath that aluminum plate. So I like to get this put on. Then I want to make sure that the spring is at a 90-degree angle to the axle. Then I'll tighten it up. Okay, now the Tamiya instructions show installing this on the truck right now, but I like to mount these steering knuckles first. I just find it easier than having to flip the whole assembly around. So this just slides into the axle stub goes in, and then this pin goes in from the top down. That, and one of the dreaded little C-clips then mounts on here. Okay, and then our steering rod just snaps onto the ball link. And remember, we rough adjusted this using the Tamiya instructions. But now it's time to do the fine adjustment, and to do that, you can see I have grid lines on my paper, and I like to have just a little tiny bit of toe in. So I adjust them based on that. I know you can't see it really good there. That looks pretty good. And now this assembly is ready to mount on the truck. The rear springs, basically the same way. There's a plastic spring pad, goes on both sides. Our U-bolts and plate. just drop over like this. And they use a lock nut on this one. The front one used one of these built-in washer nuts. Now getting these springs straight on this rear axle spring is critically important. The front is not quite as important. Still want to get them straight. But you can see that this is crooked in here. So you want to spend a minute and get it perfectly straight in the plastic housing. And then kind of double check as you go, because if you're right-handed, you'll tend to get it off to the right. If you're left-handed, the other way. So I just carefully check that along the way. And that looks pretty good. Yep. Then our rear axle pads mount on the end here with one of the short shoulder screws and a lock nut. And you'll wind up with an assembly like this with a pad on each end. So we've got our front and rear axles, and we'll go ahead and get those installed here in a minute. So now we can get the suspension mounted up. We'll do the front first. And it's very easy, actually. You just drop it into your suspension holders and use these short shoulder screws to hold it. And it takes 6 of them. One at the front on each side, one at the rear on each side, and then one, you know what, I'm going to throw, these use a 3mm lock nut. I'm going to throw a couple on here just to keep the bolts from falling out. I'm not going to tighten them, just just to keep the bolts from falling out. And then there's one more goes, if you can see it, worth a darn, from the shock to the front shock holder on each side. Like that. So I'll put the nuts on all those. We'll come back and do the rear suspension. So there's our front suspension all hooked up. Now the rear suspension is very easy. Just drop one of these collars in through here. And this really long bolt just slides all the way through. The other side. Another collar, and a lock nut. Now, a couple things to note here. Let me just get this nut on so it doesn't fall apart. Is that on these spring pads, you'll notice that the bolts run in. Okay, so you want to make sure that you get that taken care of. And again, it's very critical that the springs be mounted straight in the spring pads. Otherwise, you'll have issues with your tires rubbing on the springs. So if you get it all together and you notice that your tires are dragging on the springs because they're quite close, you'll have springs that are maybe like that, and you can loosen these and reset them. So there's that. Now we're ready to mount the two rear axles. And there's a couple things I want to show here that are very, very important and one of the easiest places to screw up. Okay, so on the rear ends, again, I built these separately, and I do have a video on how to build them that's linked in the description. One thing to point out is they do have ball bearings in them. I use ball bearings everywhere. So when the kit gives you these bronze bushings, no. You get rid of the bronze bushings and you use ball bearings. You get a ball bearing kit and you use those. So these are completely built and ready to go with ball bearings. Now, you'll notice they have a bump here on the top. Okay, that's your stop. And that goes towards the frame. Okay, so I start with the back axle, making sure the bump goes towards the frame. Put some Loctite on these. And we'll do the front and the back here. Okay, so now this mounts with these spring hangers. The bolt goes through the spring hanger, through the rear axle. We'll double check that our bumps are towards the frame, and then they just screw down to the axle pad here. Do that on both sides. Okay, now I haven't really tightened these, and I haven't put the second bolt in yet. I'll do that in a minute. So now we've got the front axle, and it also has the two bump stops. And you could either go this way or this way, and the bump stops would still be down towards the frame. But only one way is correct. And the correct way is to have the transmission hump opposite of this. If you have it this way, the rear wheels will turn like this, which doesn't work. So make sure these stops go toward the frame, and same thing, we'll take one of those spring hangers and one of these bolts and mount this here. The other thing that's a big deal, not super critical, is you want to not have this tucked underneath here when you put the other bolts in, because you can't get it up. Okay, so you got to make sure it's not stuck underneath that frame. So we'll get another spring hanger here. And voila, these are now mounted and everything looks pretty good. So the next step is actually the next step is to finish putting the bolts in. So I'm going to do that and I'll be right back. So now to get this this set up, we use some of the long shoulder bolts. And some of the short shoulder bolts. Now, the short ones are used to hook these to these radius arms to the suspension. Just do this last one here real quick. Okay, and then the long bolts are used to hold the radius arm to this rear upright. Now, you can only put one in to start with. Do the rear one. It gets a shoulder nut, so I use Loctite on it. And now the rear dog bone goes in. So you want to put some grease on it. I use the grease that came in the kit. And it simply, if I can do this where you can see it, slides in there. Slides in here. And then you throw another long bolt in here, and now that dog bone is captured. Now we just have to put 2 bolts in on the other side. You'll notice that the transmission humps are opposite of each other and the bump stops are towards the frame. So I'll go ahead and throw those bolts in. We'll do the shocks. Well, the shocks just mount pretty easily. There's a shock spacer. Bolt goes through here. Mounts through this little cover, and then it's threaded in the hole, and you can see, or maybe you can see, that I put a little Loctite in there already. And this is threaded, so we'll just thread this in. And there's a pin on this cover that lines up with a hole in the frame. And then a short shoulder bolt holds it up the top here, and a lock nut. So that completes the rear end. I already put the other 3 shocks in, as you can see. So there we go. Suspension's done. So the next step, not totally positive on the Aeromax, the next step will be to hook up the steering, which I will show you quickly how to do that, even though I do have a video on the steering. And this is assembling the transmission, which we've already done. So the next step will be installing the transmission. So let me hook the steering up really quick. And again, I have a separate video on setting up the servos and hooking up the steering and the shifting. So we'll come back with the transmission. On the transmission, it just put a little Loctite in here. And you just wiggle it into place, and it takes a little bit of wiggling, but you can get it down there. And then we have our drive shaft. We don't want to forget that. So a little bit of grease on the drive shaft. Slide it into place. And the transmission bolts down with some 3x6 screws. Starting to look like a truck now. So I'm going to go ahead and put the rest of those screws in, and I'll give you a quickie on the description on the steering and shift servos. So now I want to go ahead and hook up my steering and shift servos before I start doing a lot of stuff and I can't flip the truck over. So I'll hook up my steering servo to my radio here. And this is a radio that's already been converted for RC trucks. And what that means is, plug this baby in here. That the throttle stick goes to the center. A typical radio, this would be your airplane throttle, and it would start at the bottom. So there's a self-centering stick. So we'll turn the radio on, and then I'm going to plug in just a little battery pack to the receiver to power it up. Now you can also power it with your speed control and regular battery, but you really do want to power it up because now the radio is telling you where the center is, and we can then adjust our linkage here so that the steering is centered when the throttle is centered. And I don't know how good you can see this, but right now it's not centered. This needs to be quite a bit shorter. Remember, it was adjusted to the length of the Tamiya instruction book, but that's not the definitive guide. Still needs to be shorter. So, and we're about right there. So the way I do this is I hook it onto the servo end first. And then double check. Yep, looks good. And now we have our steering. Now the shift, I plug that into channel 5. And that's a 3-position switch here. So we have low gear, medium gear, and high gear. So I start out in the center gear and basically do the same thing. The transmission has springs that hold this in the middle, which would be second gear. So we adjust this, needs to be a little bit shorter. Till it matches those two. And that looks pretty good, a little tiny bit shorter. We'll snap that on. Double check and make sure this lines up. And then we'll have our shift. Now, I always test mine, and I test my transmission when I build them with a single D battery. If it doesn't run on a single D battery, then you've got something wrong. And it should run the whole drive line. So now I can shift it. It shifts fine. You can see the difference in the there's low gear. It's quite a bit slower. Medium gear, high gear. So our shift and steering are adjusted and work fine. We'll move on to the next step. So we'll look at finishing up the bottom of this truck. You can see these side mounts. That's what they look like right here, and they just basically mount to the frame with a 3x6mm screw, and I already put Loctite in there. You can see I already mounted the other 3, and these are the supports that hold on the side plates. Aerodynamic skirts. I don't know what the exact name is for them. So that takes care of those, and then we've got our battery tray, and our battery tray has got some mounts here that mount right to the bottom of the frame. It needs to be assembled first, so there's a bracket that bolts, it goes in here, that holds your battery. So they use this little screw here will fit a body clip to hold the battery compartment shut. That just mounts in there. This mounts up from the bottom, and there's a couple of screws that hold on this bracket to does not have a front or a back that I can see. A little bit, you can see better. So that'll just flip over here and a body clip will hold it. And then this cover holds the back end of the battery. It just mounts in here. Then, again, we'll put some Loctite on these threads. And this just sits in here like that. A 3x6mm screw. These Tamiya screwdrivers have a magnetic tip, which sometimes is quite handy. And 4 screws will hold this on. One thing nice about this setup is it leaves you a ton of room inside the cab. And I'll talk about that later. I'll install those other two in a minute. But would make a really sweet day cab. And we're going to look at that. These are the parts for the next step, which includes the inner mud flaps, the rear bumper parts, the mud flap holders, the mud flaps, and the tail lights. Now, a couple things. First off, these really don't require paint because I want them to be black, but this plastic is shiny and kind of toy-like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just wash these really quickly with soap and water, let them dry, and then I'm going to spray them with Tamiya TS80 Clear Flat. And what that does is it knocks down the shine, gets completely rid of the toy-like look of the plastic parts. So I will go do that. The second thing to note is on these mud flaps, the chrome pieces have a front and a back. One side's shiny and the other side's not. They don't really mention that in the instructions. But we want the shiny side facing aft, so they mount like this. And then a little bolt and nut holds them together. And then the third point are these tail lights. And they have lenses that just snap in place, and there's red and amber lenses. And they have a little notch here on the side that's designed to snap into a little notch here. But I have found that they will fall out. So what I do is I use this micro crystal clear glue and a little applicator to hold them in. Now, do not use plastic cement or super glue on these, because what happens is it will craze the clear pieces and just crack them and destroy them. So you got to use a clear plastic cement, micro crystal clear, Zap canopy glue, PVA glue from Hobby Lobby, anything like that will work pretty good. Even Elmer's in a pinch. I don't particularly like that one, but it works. So I will glue those in, mount the mud flaps to here, and go put some clear flat on those, and then we'll come back. Well, these parts have got some clear flat on them, but see how much better that looks? It just doesn't look like a piece of plastic anymore. And that's really what I was going for. So this rear bumper, this little cover just mounts over here, and if you were going to put lights in it, obviously you would do that first. I'm going to do an Aeromax in the future where I will build it and then take it apart and add lights, because you can easily add lights later to any Tamiya truck. You don't have to do it when you first build it. If you decide, oh, I want to get a Tamiya MFC or a Bayer SFR, the truck easily comes apart to to mount it. So there's our little light box, and then that just screws on out. Same thing here, there's a 12 millimeter and a 10 millimeter screw. And you have to be really careful to get the right ones just so you don't run out. And this little bracket just mounts on the back side of this. I know I'm quite picky about using thread lock on everything, but I don't like my trucks to fall apart. So the 10 millimeters go in here. And so this little bracket just mounts on like this. Then it bolts to the side frame here with a 12 millimeter screw. Same type of nut, shoulder nut. Several parts in this, but none of it's hard to put together. And then they use self-tapping screws that mount through the mud flap holder, through this bracket, and into the rear bumper cross member. Two of those. And that takes care of our rear bumper. Looks quite nice, actually. And then this just slides into the frame here and is held on with 4 self-tapping screws. So I'll go ahead and get that mounted. So this side fender has a little step that mounts on top, and it uses self-tapping screws to hold it. And you see a washer on there because it just fits into a slot. So a couple screws there to hold that down. This truck goes together really easily. Actually, I know I taped this in all kinds of segments, but I put together the transmission and the rear ends and the servos yesterday, and then I started on this morning, and right now it's 3 in the afternoon, so it's I could easily do this in one day if I wanted to. And then one more washer here on this screw, and it has a threaded mount in the frame and 2 holes for these alignment pins. So this just alignment pins go in, and this just mounts right in here and tightens up, and it should hold it real nice and straight. Okay, so that takes care of my fenders. They're clear flatted, the rear bumper's on. We're closing in on the finishing the frame. So the next step in the instructions is to assemble the coupler. I'm not going to do that right now because I want to paint this coupler plate my body color, so I will do that in part 2. And I'm going to show painting the body, painting this, and doing some other detail work in the back. So really then the last thing before the tires and wheels is this front bumper mount. And it's a metal bracket that just mounts like this with this plastic mount. Bolt just drops through here. And then this mounts in through here and is held with our wonderful little washer nuts that we've gotten so used to. I like to get as much done now with the truck upside down, because once you start doing things like putting the interior in, it's really hard to flip this upside down. And right now it's quite easy. There's nothing to break off. And later on there will be things to break off. Okay, so there's my chassis, basically complete, except for the coupler. And so now I can install the tires and wheels. Now, I earlier put these together, and I have shown that on many videos, but it's basically just pulling the tires over the rims. I use a couple drops of thin CA glue to hold the tires on. The rear tires and wheels are held together with 3 bolts and nuts. And they're held on with this hex adapter that just fits over here. And then a 5mm nut. The Tamiya wrench will fit this, but I find this a little easier. So there's a rear wheel. And then the front wheels, let's see here, front wheels have bearings in them. The bearing presses in place, slides over the axle, another bearing, and then a 5mm nut. So I will go ahead and put all the tires and wheels on. And there is our chassis, all complete and getting close to the driving stage. So now it's time to mount this base plate, and it just mounts like this. And there's a little bracket back here that mounts on the back edge with a couple of self-tapping screws. Let's go ahead and put that on. Stiffen things up. And one little bit here. The instructions show mounting the seats on it, but I don't do that until later because still a possibility of having to flip this thing upside down, and if the seats are here, then that is the end of that program. So what I'm going to do is cut this off. Now this is a holdover from the early days of RC when we had antennas, and so this little bracket here holds the antenna mount, but with modern radios we don't need that anymore, and so it's just sticking out there in the breeze looking kind of dumb. Just cut this apart with some nippers here. And I'll smooth it off with an X-Acto knife. And then this just mounts to the frame with these screws right here. And there's here and here. There's 4 of them. These 4 right here. And then there's a couple in the very back, right back here. So we'll go ahead and mount that down. Well, there's our base plate mounted. The seats, when it's time to install them, will mount up on top here. And since they screw from the top, it's easy to add those later. So now I've got to do some wiring. I've got my shift and steering servo here. And here I've got a Hobbywing speed control. This baby opened up. Okay, and it comes with a couple of little tie wraps, shrink wrap, owner's manual, and a gory sticker. So, get rid of the box, we don't need that. What we're going to do is we're going to run the wiring first for the servos. I've got my radio receiver here, and basically the cab is here, so all this area in the back is open. This can just tuck in underneath here and plugs into channel 1. That's my steering servo. And this servo, do it the same way. Run it up in here, and it plugs into channel 5, which is the 3-position switch we looked at earlier. Plug it into channel 5 and channel 1. And so now what I'm going to do is use some of the Tamiya double sticky tape, a piece of it here, to mount that receiver down. So we'll just cut a little piece of it. Stick it on the bottom of the receiver, and we'll figure out where it's going to go best. Now, I'm not going to hook it right this second. We're going to talk about the speed control. The speed control has wires that plug into the motor, like this. And it looks like we have plenty of cable length. So we'll go ahead and plug those in, making sure that the clear covering covers up the connectors. Again, we can just tuck these down in alongside there. And then this plugs into channel 3 on the receiver, which is our throttle. We'll do the same thing. We'll cut a little piece of double sticky tape here. Put it on the bottom of the speed control. Now it looks like I'm going to want to put the speed control on this side. Let's do that. Just peel this tape off here. Stick it down. And then the receiver. Receiver right there. Now what I do on these antennas is I use a little piece of electrical tape. Since it's black, it matches the base of the truck just fine. So we're going to tape one right here, just to keep it out of the way. We'll tape another one right here. Boom. Now we've got our speed control plug that goes to the battery box. And that is going to drop in, let's see, we'll drop it in right here. And pull it up from the bottom and get the wires out of the way. Okay, there's my battery plug. Now my battery is going to flip in here like this. This is going to hold it. And then it's just going to plug into here. Now there's an on-off switch for the speed control, which I normally don't really like on-off switches, but I'll stick this down with another little piece of double sticky tape. My theory is you always unplug the battery when you're not using the truck. On-off switch doesn't matter. But we'll mount it in here anyway. Okay, so that cleans up the inside. Now, if I turn on my radio, we should have steering. Hey, look at that. We should have forward. Yep, reverse. Now, speed controls have a feature where you can't go directly from forward to reverse. You have to reverse it twice. And that's to prevent you from going full speed forward to full speed reverse and blowing the gears out of your transmission. So we should have a nice, and we're in low gear here. So also, if I hold that, second gear, third gear, second gear, low gear. Now, I find that even low gear is enough to do anything I want with one of these trucks. So I rarely use second and third gear, and that's why I like this 55 turn motor, because it gives you that creepy low speed that is, you know, really scale like with a truck like that. So we've got our truck running, our chassis finished. Turned out really good. It was pretty straightforward to put together. So part 2, we're going to look at some of the body parts. We will look at this beautiful Ford body. And this is, Tamiya doesn't really make scale US trucks. They used to make the Freightliner Cascadia, but their license expired and they no longer produce that. The King Hauler, the Grand Hauler, the Globeliner, and the Night Hauler are just representations of trucks, and they're not an actual model of any one truck. So this is the only model left in Tamiya's line that is a scale model of a US truck. One thing I like about this body is it would make a great day cab, and especially with the underframe battery. So in the next part, we're going to, oh, looks good. We're going to talk about painting the body. We're going to paint it. We'll do the interior, the dashboard, and I'll finish up the coupler that I didn't finish in this episode. Okay, so there we go. The Tamiya Ford Aeromax build part 1. We started out with the basic kit and got it up to the running stage. Part 2 we'll do the finishing, but yeah, pretty straightforward kit. It goes together really well, looks nice. I'm excited to see it with all the aero panels on it and the coupler and everything on. We'll do that soon. If you're new to my channel, go check out some of my older videos. Grand Hauler for novices and Globeliner for novices are two particularly good ones if you're just getting into Tamiya trucks. And I've got all kinds of videos on electronics, radios, wiring, that type of thing. This radio is a radio that's been modified by me at Hobby Concepts specifically for trucks. So look for links in the description, just down in the bottom of this video, click more. You'll see links to building the transmission, building the rear ends, building and adjusting the servos, and links to purchase the Aeromax truck, completer kits, things like that that will get you successful in building your truck. So there you go. Give me a thumbs up. I appreciate those. They help with the YouTube rankings. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.